Before the specials, before the television appearances, before the name on the marquee was a name that anyone outside the comedy circuit would recognize, there was a recording. Not a professional recording, not a tape made for broadcast or commercial release, or any purpose that a production company had planned and budgeted and sent a crew to capture. A recording made the way recordings get made when nobody has arranged for one to be made, on equipment somebody happened to have, in a club that wasn't designed for recording, of a set that wasn't performing for the camera because there wasn't one. The recording itself was not remarkable in its production quality. The room noise was present throughout, the ambient sound of a club, drinks, conversation from the edges of the audience, the particular acoustic texture of a space that was designed for the people in it rather than for the microphone picking it up. The audio quality was the kind of quality that makes it clear, immediately, that you're listening to something that was captured rather than produced. Nothing was cleaned up. Nothing was mixed. The set is simply there, in the room, the way it actually was on the night it happened. What made the recording travel was not its technical quality. What made it travel was what was on it. A set so precise in its observation, so internally consistent in its perspective, so unlike anything else that was circulating on the circuit at the time, that the people who heard it responded the way people respond when they encounter something they've never heard before. They passed it on. Not to audiences, to other comedians. The path a recording like this takes through comedy circles is different from the path that commercially released material takes. It doesn't move through distribution networks or media coverage or promotional campaigns. It moves the way information moved before any of those systems existed, from person to person, carried by whoever had heard it to whoever they thought needed to hear it, traveling through a network of people who shared enough of a framework to understand what they were evaluating. The thing about a recording that travels through a community of practitioners, rather than through the public, is that the feedback it generates is of a different quality than the feedback a general audience produces. A general audience's response, the laughter, the applause, the ticket sales, tells a performer that the work is connecting. It tells them that people are responding, that the rooms are filling, that the career is moving in the direction careers need to move. But it doesn't tell them specifically what is working or why. It doesn't locate the qualities that produce the response or distinguish between the qualities that are genuinely unusual and the qualities that are merely skillful. A community of practitioners produces different feedback. When a comedian who has spent years developing their own work hears another comedian's recording and passes it on, they are making a specific judgment that what they just heard is operating at a level worth other people's attention. That judgment is not made casually by people who understand how hard the level is to reach. It is not given out of professional courtesy, or from a desire to be supportive, or from any of the other motivations that dilute professional assessment in most industries. It is made because what was heard met a standard that the person making the judgment applies to their own work and is only rarely seen met by someone else's. That's the context in which the recording traveled. Not through an audience that was hearing something entertaining, through a community of practitioners who were hearing something that met a standard they understood intimately and had rarely encountered in someone else's work. The specific set on the recording, what bits it included, what the structure of the hour or 40 minutes looked like, what the specific observations were that prompted the particular response, is not something anyone who has described the recording has been able to detail precisely. Memory is not a recording. What people remember about hearing the tape is not the specific content, but the quality of the experience of hearing it, the particular feeling of encountering a voice that is fully formed, fully specific, already arrived at the place that most comedians are still moving toward. In the early to mid-2000s, the way material traveled between comedians was still predominantly physical and personal. Digital sharing was becoming more common, but the comedy circuit's internal communication still operated largely through the kind of person-to-person transmission that had always characterized the industry. One comedian mentioning another to a third, someone passing a tape to a colleague after a show, a booking agent recommending someone to a club owner who recommended someone to another comedian who eventually found themselves listening to something they hadn't been looking for. The recording of Katt Williams's set, whatever specific night it came from, whatever specific club it was made in, entered this network at a particular moment and began to move. The people who first encountered it, by most accounts, were working comedians on the same circuit he was navigating. Performers who had enough experience in rooms to evaluate what they were hearing not as general entertainment, but as craft. As an example of the specific things that determine whether stand-up comedy is good or merely competent, as a demonstration of what it looks like when a voice is fully formed. A comedian listening to another comedian's recorded set is not listening the way an audience listens. An audience listens for the experience, for the recognition, the laughter, the pleasure of being inside a shared moment. A comedian listens for the structure, for the way the observation was built, for the timing in relation to the material, for the precision of the language in relation to the idea being expressed, for the specific quality of the perspective that underlies the material, the thing that makes this comedian's observations sound like this comedian's observations, rather than observations that any sufficiently skilled comedian could have constructed. What the comedians who first heard the recording responded to, what prompted them to pass it to the next person, was something in all of those categories simultaneously. The observation was precise. The timing was exact. The language was economical in a way that made every word feel chosen rather than arrived at. And the perspective underneath all of it was one they hadn't heard before, specific enough to be unmistakable, grounded enough to be real, original enough to be impossible to trace to any single influence. The recording's movement through the circuit during this period represents something larger than the specific set it contained. It represents the way the comedy community has always operated as a self-selecting filter for what the form can produce at its highest level. A filter that operates independently of any commercial or institutional system, and that produces its assessments through the only reliable method available: direct exposure to the work, evaluated by people who understand what they're evaluating. In the years that followed, as Katt Williams's name became a name that needed no introduction in rooms far beyond the circuit that first produced the recording, the tape itself became something that the people who had heard it early held as a private record of having been present at the beginning of something. Not the beginning of a career. Careers don't have single beginnings. They build through years of accumulated nights in accumulated rooms. But the beginning of the moment when the career's trajectory became visible to the people closest to it. When the question shifted from, "Is this going somewhere?" to, "How far is it going to go?" That shift happened not in a major venue, not through a television appearance, not through any of the events that the public history of a career tends to organize itself around. It happened in back rooms and dressing rooms and late-night conversations between working comedians, listening to a recording that someone had made on equipment that wasn't designed for recording a set, that wasn't performed for the recording. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the specials or the arenas or the name in lights. A rough recording, passed from hand to hand through a community of people who understood exactly what they were hearing. arriving at each new listener with the same effect. The recognition that something they were going to need to pay attention to had already been happening for a while. And all they had was a tape that someone happened to make on a night that nobody had flagged for anything.